Hello, and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Giselle Donnelly, and I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm joined by
Julia Joja with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown and George Washington Universities, and
Dalibor Haj, also with AEI.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace that have emerged along the line that runs from the Baltic to the Black Sea, what we call the Eastern Front, and why those are important to the United States. On today's episode, the three of us are going to talk about the prospect of NATO membership for Ukraine, the upcoming NATO summit, at which this will be a central discussion, and more broadly about how to secure the Eastern Front over the long haul. If you enjoy our discussion, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Julia, let me start with you. Why don't you frame the debate for us, and then we'll start swatting at one another.
Yes, Miss NATO here. I think it is very interesting how the NATO Secretary General has obviously coordinated his first visit to Kyiv with our podcast today. But beyond jokes, he was there to make statements that obviously, given membership complications, etc., have to stay very vague. But nevertheless, he did say in so many words that we have a quorum of all NATO member states that want to see Ukraine as a member of NATO at some point, of course. And so now the question, I think, is what does that mean? Especially as we're looking, he pointed to that too, to the Vilnius summit of NATO coming up in a few weeks, really. And of course, the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine is on the table in a way that we really haven't seen yet, because it's a country at war and before we had the taboo. And we see a lot of people, I think, weighing in on either side, not with a lot of coherent arguments. So I guess our attempt today is to try to make the discussion more coherent, I think along a few lines. One is what can be offered right now in the next few months. Two, how can we think about NATO membership for Ukraine in this sort of unprecedented framework? And isn't it time to reform NATO membership and NATO accession process anyway? Because we're not in the post-Cold War era anymore. And three, how can we think about reforming NATO defense and deterrence overall so that we can reduce the long-term costs and make deterrence more credible? How does that sound to all of you?
That sounds like a long list of topics, but you're certainly right to point out that Secretary General Stoltenberg did what we finally have been urging him to do. So let's not embarrass him in public. Dalibor, what's your take?
So I think the question really is about what sort of shape and form Ukraine's accession should take. I mean, haven't heard many voices advocating for Ukraine to join while Ukraine is still waging war and defending itself in the east and sort of bringing the alliance into the war itself. I think the sort of the real dividing line runs between people who say, well, we should bring in Ukraine at some point after the war and after it sort of jumps through all the hoops. And we don't really know when that's going to be, and in a way that enables those politicians to sort of kick the can down the road. And people who say that it is imperative that as part of whatever peace settlement comes out of the war, there be credible security guarantees given to Ukraine in the form of NATO membership or something similar to NATO membership. And I think we would like to make the argument for why the latter approach should be undertaken, and why it's really important, and why you're not going to sort of secure Ukraine, even in the case of a Russian defeat, without giving it some sort of tangible, concrete, credible security guarantees like NATO membership.
Yeah, I would offer that a better historical analogy for the current moment is not NATO expansion of the 1990s and early 2000s, but the period in 1940 and 1941 where the American and British alliance was formed in all but name, but certainly in a way that allowed Great Britain to win the Battle of Britain and to defend itself and remain the important outpost that it was for success in World War II. So that would put, the actual pressing needs, security and military needs of the moment ahead of, although there was also the Atlantic Charter, which I think would be having an analogous statement of principle that, again, was responsive, to the current moment. Maybe a renewal or an update of a statement of principles like that would help to shape the broader political framework and redefine what the alliance is, or what European security is for and should look like. So it in some ways would be much better if we could set aside the things that we think we learned during the first era of NATO expansion and looked to that earlier moment when America really, really became committed to European peace and security.
And there's also another precedent for whatever arrangements will be made with Ukraine that is not related to the post-Cold War enlargements, which is the ongoing enlargement with Finland and Sweden, which were not asked to jump through the usual bureaucratic hoops and go through a lengthy process. It was just sort of decided that they would become members. And it was a sort of act of, sort of political leadership and funding to the sort of conditions on the ground. And I think we have to be sort of open-minded enough to sort of allow for that contingency in Ukraine's case at the minimum.
Yeah, so that means I think that we should leave behind the calls that I do see now, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic in Europe, in the context of both NATO and EU. Oh, we should have them go through the bureaucratic process. Are they ready? Are they interoperable? They are not. And so then this is a good excuse. I think this should be, it's worth stating that I think we have a quorum here that this should be dropped. And we should be considering the practical implications of what kind of territory, what kind of security guarantees, how we can go about this, and how we can think about it in a cost-efficient way in terms of ensuring Europe whole and free and European security with burden sharing and coming closer to the reality that I know a lot of Europeans want to look away from, that we also, not just obviously the Ukrainians are helping us keep the Russians out, that should be obvious, but that we also should start training and understanding and knowing how to fight Russians if push comes to shove. I know that NATO until now has been trying so hard through political leaders to not NATO-wise the war, but I don't see the Vilnius summit coming up without with avoiding that in the end. As Stoltenberg said today, if we are to talk about security guarantees, long-term military aid commitment, and long-term training commitment to Ukraine, that means that actually we are going to formally NATO-ize the war.
Well, or at least NATO-ize the question of Eastern European security, which in some ways predates the war and will certainly be there. It won't go away regardless of the outcome of the war. I think it was also the reason to start talking about this, too, is to start, cajoling, pummeling, bribing, whatever. It will be necessary to bring along old NATO, if we can use that Don Rumsfeld era term. Emmanuel Macron remains a sort of Gaullist in behavior, if not in policy. The Germans, this is going to make the Germans nervous. But we do have a great opportunity in alignment with Eastern European states, and particularly Poland, people who are willing to provide the kind of burden sharing, meaning sharing the risks. Maybe that's a better way to look at it. And at least in the case of Poland, are making huge investments in their military. Having an army like that and a similar military in Ukraine, which is far from impossible, would be the most cost-effective form of, alliance security that one could imagine.
I mean, the argument should be fairly straightforward. I mean, if you remember before the war, the sort of enlargement skeptical narrative was encapsulated by Tucker Carlson's question of why should his son go and fight for Montenegro. If you remember back in 2018, 2019, and so there's this sort of idea that you could say that about any country, obviously, but I mean the sense that some people have is that by enlarging NATO, we are sort of adding liabilities to our balance sheet in a way, and making us as more vulnerable to sort of future conflicts over lands and people we know little about. Whereas the reality is the exact opposite. Like right now, like the war in Ukraine is a liability for the entire West. Like it's something we have to deal with that sort of preoccupies policymakers 24/7. And it happened precisely because Ukraine never was taken into the alliance and was never given credible security guarantees, and there was never sort of deterrence set up in a way that would prevent this war. And it's really like what we should be doing is to explain to people that if you want to see fewer situations like the one we currently see in Ukraine, we should be very forceful in bringing countries into the alliance, like-minded countries that would otherwise be vulnerable to Russian aggression.
Yeah, like-minded and that are willing and able, because that's something that I think is worth highlighting that really sets Ukraine apart from other countries that perhaps are like-minded but not as like-minded, not as willing, and not as able. And it is about costs, obviously. If we are to think about productively, constructively think about NATOizing support for Ukraine in the long term, bringing together and developing in Vilnius a plan for NATO, for feasible NATO membership, then we can easily make the argument that the costs will be far less because this would actually avoid active conflict. And one more thing to bring onto here in sort of the broad arguments that I think gets dropped, and I think we should really talk about this, is what kind of precedent does this set if we are pushing Ukraine membership aside in the context of nuclear coercion, right? NATO is the only nuclear alliance, and it is a defensive by default alliance because of these reasons. If we are setting a precedent in which Russia or anybody else can say, you will not be joining because we can threaten you with nuclear war, then really in the medium to long term, I don't see the alliance as being legitimate and valid and credible. Going back to Biden's very good statement that he keeps repeating, not 1 inch, this statement to me is a political one. We don't know if the next US president will be so staunch on not 1 inch. So how can we think about an alliance that is functioning and is credible in the medium and long term and does not give into nuclear coercion by Russia?
I mean, look, I think it's worth the two things, and that is thinking more clearly about the relationship between civilian political reform and economic reform and all those other excuses that have been held out as, roadblocks to more rapid expansion, more security-focused expansion. And this nuclear question. Look, NATO was created in the face very early on of an open Soviet nuclear threat. And it was expanded in the face of Soviet nuclear threats. So we should already have crossed that bridge. The Russian nuclear threat exists, and it is something that we must take into account. But it's always, our past experiences should suggest that this is actually a reason to solidify alliances, to prevent the use of nuclear threats and prevent nuclear coercion, short of nuclear use. And then finally, I would say, by this point in the Ukraine war, the Russian nuclear threat must have lost much of its credibility. Vladimir Putin has come close to, wrecking his conventional force in the pursuit of his Ukraine dream. And obviously, he continues to rattle the nuclear saber, but it hasn't prevented us from doing anything that we want to do. We have been self-deterred, not actually deterred by Russian actions. So, again, we just need to almost turn the telescope around and look at things from a correct perspective. And as Dalibor has said, the path forward should be challenging, but not complex.
So then, if we are to convince that some of these arguments that have been discussed before the full-scale invasion and after about technicalities and reform, etc., should be pushed aside or brushed aside, the next question then is the practical one going into Vilnius, so short term. What kind of plans or what kind of options do we have for Ukraine while the conflict is still ongoing? We know we're all waiting for the counteroffensive. We all, or the majority of us, expect that they will be able to gain some, but not all territory. So this is a conflict that is likely to drag on. We are hoping, at least I am, that the gains that Ukraine will be making in the spring and summer will convince to de-tabooize the offensive weapons that Ukraine has been asking for such a long time, and that this will then leads ideally to them for a chance for them to regain all of their territory and first and foremost be able to control and defend the territory that they have. So that's way beyond Vilnius. What kind of commitments can we think about for NATO in Vilnius practical commitments when it comes to supporting Ukraine onto this path, and of course offering them some kind of an opening at least towards NATO membership eventually?
I think there is, real problem that we are facing in the sense that although Secretary Stoltenberg can say that there is an emerging consensus within the alliance that we want to bring in Ukraine at some point, that does not translate to a great deal of enthusiasm among some members to bring in Ukraine at the earliest opportunity once the war is over, let's say. Looking at the Biden administration, I don't see them being particularly enthused by the prospect. I think it would be a fairly contentious political fight in the present climate. And the same could be said about France, Germany, whatever number of the old NATO members, if you will, where really future Ukraine membership is seen as just another liability. So the question is, what can those actors and countries that see Ukraine's NATO membership as vital to their interests do in response to that? Because, you can imagine the Poles and Lithuanians going to Berlin, going to Paris, going to Washington saying, look, this really matters to us. Please make something happen. And you'll have Secretary Blinken and others nodding in agreement and basically doing nothing. And I think that's unless things change dramatically, I think that's where we are headed, frankly, with Vilnius. And there'll be some non-committal language coming out of the summit. That wouldn't be good. So what I think should happen is for the Eastern Europeans to try to sort of step up their game a little bit. And I would like them to really try to sort of force the hand of Westerners more explicitly. So a few weeks ago, I wrote this piece on, making the case for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which many people took literally and not enough people took seriously. I wasn't quite explicitly arguing for the return of an elective monarchy in Eastern Europe, but rather for Eastern Europeans, particularly the Poles and the Balts, just being sort of more imaginative and more assertive in the sort of statecraft in the region. You could imagine a situation in which Poles will say, whatever you Germans, you French, you Americans do, we are going to extend our own sort of security guarantees to Ukraine once the war is over. And we are going to form an alliance and we'll come to Ukraine's defense in the future. They could just say that, right? There's a question of how credible it is, whether they want to do it. But that would open a very different conversation within NATO going forward. And I think that would make things possible that would not be possible if Poles just keep asking nicely for Ukraine's NATO membership.
It's funny that you say that because this is exactly the scenario Poland pushed into the corner, the scenario that I've seen or developing in several tabletop exercises over the last year, whether that was referring to Ukraine in the long term or referring to invoking Article 5. When push comes to shove, you see exactly that reluctance overall when it comes to representing the alliance. And then it's up to Poland specifically, because of more military might, to say, well, if you're not going to move, we are going to, in one way or another, move individually, and that then triggers a NATO response.
If or offer a little bit more precise focus on this, the subject, it seems to me, should be, or the goal should be to begin as soon as possible now, or even just announce that the goal is to replenish and enlarge Ukrainian capacities for a second counteroffensive within the calendar year. I mean, the campaigning season, will come to a pause at some point when the mud comes back in the fall. But being able to deliver a second substantial blow to the Russian positions in Ukraine really could make a huge difference. Even if the Ukrainians only gain some limited successes in the pending or in the next months or weeks or whenever, the long storied counteroffensive begins. So making that, not worrying so much about or framing the long-term question in terms of what do we do immediately to make sure that the momentum is continuous. Again, regardless of the tactical outcome, this is going to be a real struggle for the Russian army to defend even the trench lines and fortifications that they've made. They've squandered a huge amount of manpower in Bakhmut this year, and even if it's just Wagnerites, they're just running out of Schlitz or Bud Light or whatever you like these days. And again, this is achievable. If you start now you could transfer another couple hundred tanks and blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff, some more artillery through the Polish military or just, wherever you can find some things. I noted one of the things that I really noted the last couple of days that the South Koreans made noises about supplying the Ukrainians. That's hugely important. They're a great source of advanced weaponry that they currently have in their stocks, but also have, warm production lines for frontline systems. So, rallying the Western world considered strategically for the purpose of giving Ukraine a second punch capability, I think would be appropriate and a really good use of, everybody's political wasta at Vilnius and afterward.
I think you don't even have to, if you cannot find NATO consensus on that kind of specific language, second counteroffensive, I think one can even make it more abstract, but it would really feed into the issue that we now have, because we keep Biden and Scholz and all these others keep saying, for as long as it takes. How about living up to that with a NATO commitment in Vilnius to say we are going to ensure continuous ammunition production, say, not even weapon systems, but ammunition production and training, because we know that that's a shortfall too, in the long run for Ukraine as part of the commitment of the alliance members individually, if you cannot find consensus for the language of the alliance overall, so that would send the message we're not hiding and pushing then Ukraine into peace negotiations when they've only achieved as much as they could with the weapons that we've given them in the calendar year in the summer, one. And two, it would demolish the narrative of that we have now internalized in the West. Well, Putin is in for the long run. Time is on his side because he knows he's counting on us uncommitting from Ukraine with this kind of message, this kind of commitment in Vilnius for ammunition, for training, smaller things. This would send a very clear message to the Kremlin. No matter how much cannon fodder you're throwing at this, we're not going to abandon Ukraine because this is a matter of essential European security.
Well, so how about replacing as long as it takes with as fast as we can? Time is often the most precious resource in any war. And just saying we're going to put the pedal down would be almost the best thing we could do.
So if I may, Julia, I think what you propose is sensible, but to me that's, let's say, sort of necessary, but not a sufficient condition for victory. And I would almost, without sort of going full realist, when it comes to sort of helping Ukraine today and now, sort of like move away from sort of trying to tweak the language to really looking at what governments do rather than what they say. And what the Ukrainians really need is for us to sort of change this approach through which we just give little tranches of assistance to the Ukrainians every 2 months instead of front loading whatever we can get them now. I mean, I don't need any language about second offensive coming out of Vilnius. I want this administration to really sort of throw all the fighter jets and all the rusty tanks they can find at the problem and just sort of do it quickly. And I don't know like if that mindset is going to change again. Like could Eastern Europeans force the issue somehow in Vilnius? Maybe, but like I'm pretty sure they've been sort of raising this since the beginning.
Well, but they could accelerate the Poles have received 100 and some M1s. Unless there's something in the contract that Joe Biden has to approve a Lend-Lease program or something like that. There are capabilities. I mean, and I would think from a Polish point of view, keeping the pressure on in a way that leads to a sooner rather than a later success would have high strategic value. I think second counteroffensive is possibly not the greatest, selling point. So it might require a different framing, but I think that's what it comes down to. I mean, the point I intend to make is that the situation prior or post or after a Ukrainian counteroffensive is a critical time politically and strategically, but making sure that there is, either a replenishment or an increase in Ukrainian capacities to keep the momentum. And they're going to pay a big price to gain some momentum. And the real question will be how much breathing space will the Russians have to reconstitute versus how much capacity will the Ukrainians have to exploit whatever successes they win. And again, you can see the opportunity coming as it did last year in the late fall, early winter. And we can get there from here.
So then to conclude, how about for as long as it takes to regain all territory and as fast as possible?
I'd say let's put it as fast as possible. Let's put the urgency up front. I hope Secretary Stoltenberg and everybody else is listening because, if they would just do what we say, things would turn out much better. All right, then. There you have it. So from me, Giselle Donnelly, thank you for listening to the Eastern Front, and for my colleagues,
Julia Joja and
David Borohacz.
Our podcast is dedicated to the security challenges that exist along the line from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website at aei.org or on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also be in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag EasternFrontPod, all one word. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us. Thanks for joining us. I want to end quickly with a preview of one of next week's episodes. We'll be joined again by General Ben Hodges, a former commander of U.S. Army Europe, and we'll be talking in greater detail about Ukrainian options for this counteroffensive. So you won't want to miss that one. So see you next time.